Okay, well, grace and peace. We are going to be dealing with some questions that have come up. And these questions beginning have to do with the Christian in the world. And because the Christian is in the world, we face a lot of issues, a lot of controversial things. And so we want to talk about it. And what does the Bible have to say about it? And so the first question that we're going to look at tonight is the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Today, the verdict came in that he was counted not guilty on all charges. All charges against him were dropped. And so the question is, when there's this type of story or another, it's in the news, it's high profile, we're seeing it. Maybe we see some of the footage, there's video footage, we hear about it, we're watching the trial commence, then the trial comes to an end. All throughout this, how is the Christian supposed to respond? Well, the first thing is that we are not to pass judgment before hearing both sides of the case. Proverbs 18:17 says, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him." So you don't know the truth. We can look at a tape, we can look at the film footage, we can see photos, we can have a lot of information that's coming from this type of media or another. However, the Bible tells us not to pass judgment. This is a command from the Spirit of God to us. He is the Lord of all, and He is the one who tells us what and what not to do. And He says we're not to pass judgment before hearing both sides. And we often apply that when it comes to us talking to people that we know, but we may not pass that through our minds when it comes to cases, court cases. In fact, that is the actual context of this verse. Do not pass judgment before hearing both sides. Proverbs 18:13, it tells us something similar. Proverbs 18:13 says, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame." And that is exactly what has happened in a lot of these cases. A lot of people have passed judgment. They've come to conclusions before they've heard. Whether it is a white cop shoots a black man, or in this case, here's a white man, maybe Hispanic, who has shot and killed two men and injured another. And again, the question comes up, what is the Christian's response supposed to be? We're not supposed to start to come to conclusions and make judgments until we hear all the facts, until we hear all the truth. And many Christians I've observed have been doing this. They've already come to conclusions before this man had his place in court. That is wicked. We're not to do that. Secondly, we should remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7. After he said how we're not supposed to judge wrongly, he tells us how to judge. So the scripture says, do not judge lest you be judged. By the measure that you judge, you yourself will be judged. We're not to assume on the motives of people. We're not to say, this man did this because he's a racist. We don't know that. You don't know that. I don't know that. Only God knows that, and the individual, because that is a heart matter. We're not to judge people's hearts. We're not to judge people's motives. We're not to judge people's thoughts. Unless we're saying that we are a member of the Trinity, we have divine omniscience, knowing all things, then it is blasphemous and wicked and just flat out sinful for us to do that. We're not to judge that way. Well, how are we to judge? Well, we're to judge the way Jesus continues. He says, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye?" So we are to first and foremost remember that we are sinners before God. We're first and foremost to remember, no matter what this person did, who has been arrested and is going to be put on trial, that we ourselves have sinned against the holy God, deserve the wrath of God, and if we are Christians, we have been spared that wrath and been given mercy. And that should humble us. We should not be proud and arrogant and look down on someone because they are having their day in court. Because if we had our day in court before the judge of all, before the court of all courts, we would be definitely guilty, but we have been given mercy. So we should be humble as we are observing this, not looking down on others, forgetting that we ourselves are sinners. We are also not to violate Christ's words, where he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. There he is alluding to the Old Testament Levitical law, where it was not the power of the individual to take vengeance. Vengeance, wrath, justice, capital punishment was in the hands of the court, not the individual. I was not to go out and be a vigilante and try to get my own justice. No, this isn't Batman. That's not what we do. We are to rely on what Christ said, that when someone is arrested, we leave it into the hands of the magistrates, unto the governing authorities to rule over that court, that trial, and bring justice about as the Lord wills. So we're not to take matters into our own hands by rioting, burning down people's things, going out, marching, protesting, screaming at people, getting into fight with police officers. All of this is violating the very words of Christ. We do not take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That is in the hands of the magistrates. On the contrary, we are to trust the Lord. And the last thing I would say here is that we do not give in to the mob. We do not give in to the crowds. That would be either sides. Here in Acts 14:11, it says, when the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priests of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. Now, the crowds wanted to worship Paul and Barnabas. The crowds were for Paul. They were for him so much that they wanted to worship him. And Paul and Barnabas rushed in among them and said, don't do this. We're men just like you. But here's the strange thing about crowds. A few verses later, it says this. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds. Now, these are the same crowds that wanted to worship him. They persuaded the crowds. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. So this is the reason why we don't side with the mob. We don't side with the crowds. The crowds, 1 second, want to worship you, want to crown you king. And a few moments later, they're ready to stone you and do. The crowds are not the way to find justice. And let me say this, Christians, conservatives, that includes conservative crowds. We don't go with the left crowds. We don't go with the right crowds. We go with what is just, what is right. We make righteous judgment, not based on the ethnicity of someone. We don't say that a man is racist merely because his ethnicity is Caucasian and the other man is a victim merely because his ethnicity is African American or some other minority. That is not righteous judgment. We do not come to the defense of someone because they are on our political side. Oh, he must be right because he's a conservative, or he must be right because he voted for this thing. That's not righteous judgment. We're also not to make a judgment on someone based upon their history. Someone can have a sinful past, but that doesn't mean they're guilty of what they're being accused of. All of us have sinned against God, and as Christians, we should know this first and foremost, that we have a bad background, but God can bring about change. And just because we did this, it doesn't mean that we're guilty of that. None of these things, if we are doing them, are in line with Scripture. So how do we respond to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial? How do we respond to the many other trials that are coming up and even those that have come? Well, we must remember to not judge before we hear the whole story. We must remember that we must remember our own sin. We must remember that we are not to take vengeance into our own hands, and we do not side with the crowd making unrighteous judgments, but we are to make righteous judgments based upon truth.